Welcome, everybody, to Radicalized Truth Survives. We think it's episode 57, and we can't believe it ourselves. We've just been plugging away week after week, trying to bring you the greatest minds in the cognitive warfare that we are currently embroiled in. And we are not going to fail you ever, but in particular, we are bringing you an interview with Dr. Mia Bloom, which is like so brilliant. And I know I say it every week, but I do not lie. Do I lie? I don't lie. I don't lie, right? We have
no lies detected.
We have an incredible interview with Dr. Mia Bloom. Let me back up. I'm Heidi Cuda. We got Jim Stewartson. We got High Fidelity. As you guys know, we are an investigative show about disinformation. And who better to bring in and hit hard in the new year than Dr. Mia Bloom, who's been studying radicalization for 30 years, speaks 8 different languages, wrote an incredible book called Pastels and Pedophiles, Inside the Mind of QAnon, with a partner who understands the psychology of all of this. And holy moly, we're going to bust out some news. But one last thing, you guys probably saw her in Dr. Charles Creel and Kat Gellin's film Disinformed, where she really explains the radicalization process and how ISIS techniques were being used to radicalize women and go after people in the wellness community as well. So hang on, we're gonna have a hell of an interview. Yeah.
I just want to say that as brilliant as Mia is, as people find out, she is just as kind of an actual human being. Mia and I, have become friends over the last year, and she's just a wonderful person. So
isn't that just fantastic? I feel so grateful. Like, we are making friends throughout the world with the greatest people because we're in troubled times. So the fact that we count, Dr. Bloom as a friend, and Keir Giles as a friend, and Wes Clark as a friend, and Paul Mason and Sweeney, and I can go on. We are very lucky. In a weird way, we're kind of lucky to do this work. And in an even weirder way, we're almost a bit lucky to have been traumatized by it, because we continually interview people who de-traumatize us. No, I was trying to put a little bit of lipstick.
No, that's the silver lining. You're not going to be able to do that.
I agree.
Right.
I just have one thing to say. Let's get weird.
Front loaded.
Okay, everybody. Oh my God, that was hilarious. You don't have to get weird. You guys are weird.
You're a weird one, Heidi.
I know you are, but what am I? I know you are, but what am I? In all weirdness, if we don't know our history, we are doomed to repeat it, which is why I dropped a Byline Weekend Supplement interview with Dr. David Pepper. Our viewers know David. I don't think he's a Dr. Pepper. I just threw that in there. He's actually a lawyer and a politician and an author and a great friend of the show. Our viewers know him from multiple Radicalized Pod episodes, but this piece is so damn important, the return of the Jim Crow backlash to a diverse America. I was ashamed when we met David that I did not know the rich history of the post-Civil War era, where we had hundreds and hundreds of Black elected officials, and that Black voters were registering in numbers beyond white voters in southern states, and that we had governors and congressmen, and it was incredible. And then what happened? The backlash, the KKK, the Jim Crow laws, the Supreme Court co-signing on all this shit. And so much of the same voter suppression that we are dealing with today in states like Ohio, where Hi-Fi lives, are tactics that they used in the Jim Crow era. So I wanted to bring everybody's attention to that, because that is a very vital interview. Comments, gentlemen, or moving on?
I mean, if you want to look at Jim Crow and the backlash to, Black Americans, look at Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you can look at Trump and a lot of this fascist insurgency as a backlash against liberal democracy, which is ultimately what they, don't want.
Yeah, right.
let's just acknowledge the fact that the only thing that has changed from that era to this is they no longer wear robes and hoods. They put on suits and go to the state capitals.
Yes,
Yeah.
and yes, please read Dr. Pepper. Please read the non-Dr. Pepper's book, Laboratories of Autocracy. By the way, he just gave me an advanced copy of his upcoming book that I'm reading this weekend, and I'm very excited about that. We're going to bring him back on to tell you more about it. I know, that's what I'm saying. Like, through all of this trauma, we meet great people. All right. Okay, so moving right along here, one of my Substack founding members, Clark, a good friend of Jim's also, asked me to put together a list of important books to understand how to fight back against the fascist creep. So I did. I've unlocked it for a couple of days, but this is a very good starter kit. And it's interesting, guys, because pretty much all these people we've had on our show. So we've got Jason Stanley, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, Nancy McLean, John Sweeney's book. It's all there. Have a look, share it with your friends, because I put a lot of work into that, and Keir Giles. And I also summarized some of the, main lessons from Paul Mason from these books. So have a look. Lastly, one thing the January 6th committee did very masterfully is they encouraged Republicans to tell the story of the insurrection. And so in Carol Cadwalader, our friend from across the pond, her latest report in The Guardian, she shows a Tory whistleblower who said British intelligence refused to investigate evidence that a Russian spy was attempting to cultivate and influence conservatives with money and other means. And why I'm getting all heated when I say this is the most important paragraph for me, which was buried way down in this report, is that Putin is accused of deploying more spies in London at this moment than at the very height of the spies that were deployed during the Cold War. So I think I think we're very naive to underestimate the severity of these infiltrations.
I would offer the point of order that in America, I'm sure there are Russian spies, but Putin used our capitalist nature against us and merely purchased assets in North America.
It's not about spies and fucking double agents and that shit, right? Like that, sure, there's some of that. But the influence, like Hawkeye says, is just bought. It's purchased.
Yeah.
Like people are paid to make other people believe falsehoods.
Yeah.
That is.
Here's my crypto wallet. Donate to my live stream.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've got to get out of the mindset that like Russian influence is fucking IRA bots or Russian spies. It does not work that way. Look at Mike Flynn. He claims to be a fucking American, and he, is he a Russian spy? I wouldn't call him that. I would say he is a Russian puppet. But he's an asset. He's an asset, and his influence has been bought and paid.
I think and her exact words were intelligence agents. So whether you call them a spy, whether you call them an intelligent agent, whether you call them an asset or a propagandist, it's all part of the same war. And again, that's why I refer to Keir's 84-second explainer, because the types of people that they cultivate are right there in his explainer of all of these, people with deviant behaviors that are still trying to get back at the world for perceived wrongs. So I think that's a very important point, that we're dealing with a lot of similar characteristics across the spectrum of who they deploy to do this type of work.
The pattern, unfortunately, that seems to underlie a lot of the most enthusiastic Russian propagandists is that they have been dealing with severely damaged personalities and personal failure for most of their lives. In fact, the overlap between the number of Russian propagandists who also turn out to be convicted sex offenders is absolutely startling. There are some deep-seated fundamental personality flaws that actually predispose people to being available to be made use of by Russia. And if you look back at the KGB handbooks for recruiting agents of influence, agents of subversion, or indeed propagandists, then you can see very clearly that Russia understood the misfits make the good targets, the people with a grudge, the people who feel they've been treated unfairly by the world because they've been consistent failures, and therefore seek revenge. And you can see that revenge coming through so strongly in some of the verbal attacks that you hear from the trolls, from the so-called independent journalists, the ones pushing the Russian propaganda lines, because the bile and the vitriol and the hatred that they pour out when they're talking about people who criticize Russia, it's extremely personal, and it's plainly tapping deeply into their own personality defects.
Yeah, I can't see that enough. I hope the whole world sees it, because the characteristics, like we were saying, among all the different assets that Russia deploys, they share those characteristics in common. So not unrelated, let's hear the word phrase of the week.
Word phrase of the week this week is reality distortion field. And a reality distortion field, as you can see, here we have Steve Jobs. It was actually a term created in 1981, and it had to do with the combination of Steve Jobs' charisma and intellect to convince people of impossible things. I would argue that that has been the case since time immemorial. People impose their worldview on others and thus gain popularity, build a movement, build a cult, etc. But currently it's being used by, well, Michael Flynn to create an army of radicalized insurgents in the United States. So, reality distortion field.
I wrote that phrase down, and I may have picked it up from something I had read, but I wrote that phrase down in one of my first articles after going to QAnon Twitter. I called it a reality distortion field because that's literally what it felt like. It was like there's a door to QAnon Twitter. They kind of separated it out, and once you cross it, you're in a fucking different world altogether. And all of the people that are in there are in this other world. They are just, it is distorted, and just being in there is painful. And the reason is because it doesn't match up with your own reality, right? And so it gives people cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is another good word phrase, which literally just means mental pain. It means I can't process what you're saying to me because it does not comport with my actual reality. And so when I went into QAnon Twitter, and it was just racism and shoe drops and fucking Russian propaganda, it was just it gave me cognitive dissonance and was very upsetting. And that's a version of what everybody in these cults experiences all day long.
Amazing. And I'm really excited because we're going to be talking with Dr. Bloom, who prefers Mia, but I like saying Dr. Bloom because she earned it. We're going to be talking about just that with her.
Yeah, so, like 8 times or something.
All right. So let's go on to why it matters.
Why does it matter? Why does it matter? Why high fidelity?
Why does it matter? First story this week. The gas is always greener, but it still stinks.
I love it. I love his headlines. Ladies and gentlemen, and non-binaries, you're never going to get this kind of news anywhere else.
I do like my headlines, I'll admit it. So this story this week is about how Ohio, with the stroke of Governor Mike DeWine's pen, has now labeled natural gas as a green energy resource. Yeah, I think we all know that anything extractive like this is not a green renewable resource. And I would also like to point out to everyone the fact that Governor Mike DeWine is tied to the Ohio nuclear bribery scandal.
Oh,
Look,
that sounds great.
yeah, it's the largest bribery scandal in Ohio's history. They're attempting to rewrite laws to alter reality, provide their own reality distortion field. And there are energy companies misbehaving and breaking the law, helping them do so. Gee, where have I heard that before? I don't know. That's why it matters.
It's just, I think it's so important. Full disclosure, I knew nothing about Ohio politically until I became friends with Hi-Fi, but that's really when we became friends with David Pepper, who started explaining to us what was happening in the state houses. And then I was like, oh, Roe versus Wade being overturned, state house, everything you can go through, you can look and see where these games were being played in various states. So very, very important.
Speaking of games being played in the state of Ohio, I would like to remind everyone that Peter Thiel, the man who has recently been hit for pumping and dumping crypto to the tune of $1.8 billion, he bought the Ohio junior senator seat for his friend and mentee, J.D. Vance. Meanwhile, Reid Hoffman of the PayPal Bratva continues to hand out money to the Ohio Democratic Party. My state's so screwed.
I just was visualizing. Thank you for that Peter Thiel moment. I was just envisioning Connor creating us a now for a Peter Thiel moment.
Oh, hi. Thanks for checking in. I'm still a piece of garbage.
Because every episode, Hi-Fi gets in a Peter Thiel moment.
Oh, hi. Thanks for checking in. I'm still a piece of garbage.
Okay. All right. Next up.
All right. Next story this week. Crowdfunded coups. As some of you may have noticed, Brazil had itself a little coup attempt there. And guess what? The crowdfunded insurrection leaves paper trail for police. Gee, why does this sound familiar?
Sounds familiar.
Hold on. Oh, yeah. The site that's helped send people to D.C., Give, Send, Go, by the way, who is their only payment processor? Stripe, which was funded and founded by Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. Yeah, and I just remember the Canadian insurrection and what I found in that data. And yet the best time could come up with is Give, Send, Go made a lot of money. I don't know what I'm going to have to do to get through to people that reality is you have a serious problem with money laundering online, destabilizing the world. Get it together, people. Thank you. That's why it matters.
I feel like that needed a now for a Peter Thiel moment again, because it's always in there. Okay.
Oh, would you like to have another Peter Thiel moment? Let's have another Peter Thiel moment.
Oh, hi. Thanks for checking in. I'm still a piece of garbage.
Third story.
Not particularly.
Too bad. Too bad. I'm on a roll. Let's keep it going, folks.
All right.
Third story this week. The internet is still trying to kill you. That's right. The internet is still trying to kill you. The unreleased social media and January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. We have such revelations as Twitter amplified radical right-wing philosophies, QAnon. We discussed there was an entire through the looking glass segment of Twitter called Quitter, Q-U-I, anyway. And one of the things even this report fails to mention is that Peter Thiel was one of the primary investors in Facebook in the beginning. Peter Thiel ran Palantir that helped Cambridge Analytica scrape data from Facebook. Yuri Milner, the bagman of Usmanov, was one of the primary investors in Twitter and Facebook. How much more do we need? And even our esteemed investigators miss that network, and I'm not sure what it's going to take.
Well, not only did they miss some things in that report, they didn't even fucking publish it.
Yeah.
What? I mean, somebody had to leak it or whatever. Like,
Yep.
that's a dereliction of fucking duty. I'm sorry, but if you have that information and you don't share it with the American people, you're covering it up. That is functionally what you're doing. And I'm sorry if Liz Cheney's political opponent wasn't the main target of that particular report, but it's just as important or more than Donald Trump and Mark Meadows' text messages.
I would also bring this up that Liz Cheney has already hired Koch's i360 for help with their data strategy moving forward. So
Great.
keep that in mind.
I would also just like to chime in that I think Hi-Fi just likes to say Uzmanov. And also
You like to say Bagman.
Bagman too. I
Bagman.
love Bagman and Uzmanov.
Actually, you know my two favorite Russian words? Semyon Mogilevich. Anyway.
Okay. The thing that's very real though is this is something that Hi-Fi and I were talking about earlier. You know, when we say where are our intelligence agencies, like either incompetent or complicit, what other choices do we have? Slow, you know, which goes under incompetence. So, you know, again, this is the year
They go together. That's the problem.
Oh
right?
man,
You've got people that are complicit,
Mhm.
and the incompetent ones just don't give a shit.
Wow, right? Just the bureaucratic mindset. Wow.
I mean, let's just refresh our audience's memory that Christopher Wray worked for a law firm that did business with Russian oligarchs. I don't know.
It's a problem.
I mean, dude, he was hired by Trump, and he's in the fucking Federalist Society, and the only goddamn investigating he did into foreign interference was the fucking Chinese. He found one Chinese agent. Like, what the fuck is going on? You've got 30% of America who are literally believing Kremlin ideology. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah,
I'm gonna talk about a little bit more.
Yeah, actually, you know what I think? I think it's time for Hellscape.
Jim Stewartson's Hellscape. Oh fuck.
This week, I want to talk about American ISIS. Part of the reason I think it's important is because we're talking to Dr. Mia Bloom during this episode, and she has studied ISIS techniques. And I, over the last 2 days, endured 20 hours of Mike Flynn's QAnon PSYOP tour. And I'm here to tell you that this is American ISIS. It is literally American ISIS, and I don't mean that in a metaphorical sense. I mean that in the sense that Mike Flynn did multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, where he was fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. He knows ISIS and Al-Qaeda better than almost anyone, and he commissioned a set of research in 2012 about radicalization and PSYOPs in the Middle East, and how that relates to the American public. If you understand anything about ISIS techniques and how they radicalize people, it uses all of the same things that Mike Flynn does. It sets up cult leaders like Donald Trump and now Mike Flynn, and it injects a syncretic version of religion. You know, in the case of Islamic extremists, a radical version of the Quran and Islam. And in the same way, fascists like Mike Flynn use Christianity to radicalize people using a bizarre version of the Bible that, you know, has been wholly manufactured by fascists to radicalize people. I'm not going to play any of these videos, but I just wanted to kind of briefly go through how this works. I watched this for 20 fucking hours, and it's punishing. Even when I can take a break I want, most of the time I'm editing or something, still being in a reality with people who are completely brainwashed, is challenging, and it gives you an insight into what it must be like to actually be there and to believe it. This particular event was at Greg Locke's church. Greg Locke, for example, in this clip, says, "Oh, we got to shoot them all in the name of God," and he goes, "Pop, pop, 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 pop." You can see with his stand there. Greg Locke believes in QAnon, literally believes in QAnon ideology, and believes that Mike Flynn is involved in it. It's at his church. One thing I always need to remind people is that this tour is named after Alexander Dugin's book. It is something that needs to be understood. The Great Awakening versus the Great Reset is literally the name of Alexander Dugin's book. Alexander Dugin started the Nazbol Party in Russia, which is a combination of Bolshevik and Nazi. The anti-vax propaganda here is criminal. It is a version of white replacement theory, where all of the liberals are trying to kill you with vaccines. It's insanely dangerous. And just as an example, Simone Gold went to jail for six months because she was a fucking insurrectionist. And she's up here trying to explain to you why you shouldn't take the most basic possible healthcare step. Then you have grifters like this guy, Mark Burns, who's literally Roger Stone's lawyer, who gives white people in this cult excuses for being racist. That's his role, and he knows it. Then you have people like Sherry Tenpenny, who's this sort of grandmotherly looking lady who is here to tell you that they're murdering tens of millions of people with vaccines. Again, when somebody internalizes this and believes it, they think that the government, that the healthcare system, that their neighbors, that their friends, that their loved ones are trying to kill them. That is how you create a genocidal cult, just like ISIS did. These guys are literally here to tell you that there should not be separation of church and state, and that somehow the separation of church and state is not constitutional, even though the Establishment Clause is in the first fucking amendment, which means freedom from religion, not freedom of religion. That's not what it says. It's freedom from religion. But none of that matters, because it's a reality distortion field that's purposely being set up to create American ISIS. We've got Kash Patel, who is literally just a 4chan troll, who was the chief of staff at the Pentagon on 1/6. Look at this chud. He's a moron. He's been running ops for the Russians, for Devin Nunes and Rudy Giuliani and Mike Flynn for years. This guy, literally from a fascist cult, from Falun Gong, the Falun Gong cult. He works for Epoch Times, which is a massive propaganda network. And this guy is here to basically just tell you all about QAnon stuff. Funny enough, he pissed off Mike Flynn because he basically outed him as Q, and Mike Flynn lost his mind but couldn't help but say it's a damn good psyop, which is, you know, fair enough. But it's a psyop, again, designed to create a radicalized death cult. ISIS was a death cult. That's what he's trying to create with people like this. These National Apostolic Reformation quote prophets who are here to pretend channel God. And look at all the old white people standing up. This is all designed step by step by step to pull people into madness, into racist, spiritual, holy war. Again, it's ISIS. You have operatives like Anna Kate, who I'm not even going to get started. She's Project Veritas. Mike Flynn. So we're going to talk to Mia Bloom about the way that children are weaponized against women. In ISIS, they literally had save the children was the main meme. It was the main way that they got women, because the infidels were going to come to torture and rape your kids. That was literally what ISIS did to get women involved. And that's literally what Mike Flynn has been doing for 7 fucking years. Started with Pizzagate. Pizzagate, again, was generated from the Podesta emails, which were hacked by the Russian government. FYI, Donald Trump calls into all of these now because his son. So, look, Mike Flynn invited Katie Hopkins, one of the most virulent racists on planet Earth, to speak at his QAnon conference, to talk about how there is persecution against purebloods. Purebloods are not allowed in the United States. So she literally broke in through Mexico. This woman is just shy of Richard Spencer. Really. If you haven't run into Katie Hopkins, she's literally just a racist for a living. Why is she on stage? Because she's trying to help Mike Flynn create an identity cult that is going to create violent revolution in the United States. Again, the exact same techniques for the exact same purpose as ISIS. If you haven't seen Stop the Shot, It Might Be Hot, We Lost the Plot. It's good for a little humor, but it's not actually funny. Here's Mike Flynn dancing around to a song designed to brainwash you into not getting a simple shot that will save your fucking life. Laura Logan is here to do more Pizzagate stuff. She talks about Goebbels and the big lie. she's been Eric Prince's propagandist for well over a decade. Here she is, whitewashing Eric Prince on 60 Minutes. God knows, 11 years ago or something. Mike Lindell, for God's sake. And again, on day 2, the exact same message as the first day. Jesus is king. Donald Trump won the election, and General Flynn is America's general. That's the message. This is the cult. They're trying to pull Jesus into the same circle as Donald Trump and Mike Flynn. That's how you create an authoritarian cult. And when you have the authoritarian cult, the way you radicalize them is through people like Lee fucking Dundas, who's here to tell you all about how she was waging lawfare on the Special Olympics. Here this is incredible. Here she goes over all of the literally illegal shit she did to try and interrupt the U.S. food supply. That's the kind of thing that ISIS does and did. Interrupt food supplies, cause pain and violence and hunger and death. It is a death cult created by somebody who knows very well how to make them. Sean Fuchs, he uses music to hypnotize people into these chants and mantras, and he brings God in, and he does all of this love bombing bullshit. And then he throws in, it's the gates of hell, and they're coming for you, and if you don't, buy into our cult, you're gonna fucking die. That's his message, no matter how wrapped up in fringe and hats and bullshit. He's trying to kill you. Mike Flynn likes to pretend that he has nothing to do with QAnon, but his half the second day was literally just pure QAnon fiction. This guy is up here to tell you about all of the billboards he bought in Times Square with literal QAnon shit. It's actual, there's plenty of times in here where it comes up just Q. Here's all the Pepes and the Patriots in Control and the fucking Truth Seeker, and it is QAnon. All of it. Right after that, Mike Flynn gets up and talks about how he ran an op in Florida with Matt Gaetz. And here he brags about how he can actually influence Jim Jordan's weaponization of government committee. Matt Gaetz, remember, is the one who absolutely pantsed Kevin McCarthy for a fucking week so that he has no power, so that the power is in the hands of Matt Gaetz and Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene, because that's what Mike Flynn and his allies want. They want cult members making these decisions. They want cult members weaponizing the government. This guy starts out this clip by shouting out Mike Flynn's speech about digital soldiers in November 2016 and ends up with the QAnon slogan, "Where we go one, we go all," which is the same slogan that Mike Flynn did on July 4th in his fucking backyard. Julie Green claims to get her prophecies from her fucking iPhone. She's got a huge following. Hundreds of thousands of people listen to this nitwit who just makes shit up as she goes along. It would be embarrassing in a junior high school play. She's just acting, and it's embarrassing. But hundreds of thousands of people give her fucking money and believe her bullshit because they've created a reality distortion field to create American ISIS. I'm gonna keep saying it. So look, I'm getting to the end here, and I apologize for maybe getting a little heated, but this is an intentional, systematic plan to take American citizens, strip them of their identity, their morals and ethics, and turn them into brainwashed ISIS members. What do I need to fucking say about Roger Stone, who spent the entire time denying he had anything to do with 1/6? And if you look at the date on this, which is a week before the insurrection, Roger Stone is lying out his fucking ass like he does about everything. And getting towards the end here, Pizzagate again. Liz Krogan. She is a Pizzagate propagandist and has been for 6+ years. And she's on stage at Mike Flynn's PSYOP yesterday doing the same shit, creating more ISIS members, like the guy who showed up at the pizza parlor with a gun. That's what they want. They want guys like the guy with the gun. Because you know what he was at the time? A suicide bomber. What did ISIS do? Made suicide bombers. Just an absolute roll call of traumatic propaganda. And I'll end up here. Here's Mary Flynn, Mike Flynn's sister, literally talking about giving people courses to train them in child trafficking. She means, of course, in how to fight it, but that's actually not what she means. She wants people to internalize it. She says it out loud. I want you to internalize that pedophilia is their way of life, but we're going to fight them together. That's ISIS, American ISIS. It's being intentionally created inside our country. It is a national emergency, and we need to stop putting our head in the sand about it. I rest my place.
Normally, I just try to come up with a quick intro so we can get right to the guest or right to the clip. But I think it's really important that we read you Dr. Mia Bloom's CV, because you have to know just how amazing it is that this woman has come on our little podcast. Mia Bloom is an International Security Fellow at New America and a professor at Georgia State University. She's conducted research in Europe, the Middle East, South Asia, and speaks 8 languages. She's authored multiple books and articles on violent extremism, which we are going to talk about, and Pastels and Pedophiles Inside the Mind of QAnon with Sophia Moskalenko was a pivotal inspiration for the film Disinformed, which shows exactly what's happening to all our friends in the yoga community who do not appear to be themselves anymore. Her upcoming book, which we're also going to talk about, Veiled Threats, Women and Jihad, is coming out in a few months. But it's also very important to note she's a former term member of the Council on Foreign Relations, held appointments at Princeton, Cornell, Harvard, McGill, and she also serves on the Anti-Radicalization Advisory Board of the Anti Defamation League and the UN Terrorism Executive Directorate. But wait, there's more. She has a PhD in political science from Columbia University, a master's in Arab studies from Georgetown University, and a double honor degree in Russian history and Islamic studies from McGill University in Montreal. And I'm getting chills. So before we...
Why are you inviting these slackers at our show?
Yeah, she was such an underachiever. Oh my God.
So before we actually introduce you to the beautiful
Crazy.
Dr. Mia Bloom, let's just hear her in Disinformed.
They're showing images from Greek mythology. I think this is Cronus eating his children. And they're using this to say, you see, they have been eating the children forever. This one says, diversity will never bring her back. I mean, this could have been a picture taken in 1939. And the idea is that it's always white children. One day they will ask, why didn't you fight for my future? Overwhelmingly white children, battered and bruised, because they understood their audience were the yoga moms. Because they understood their audience were the yoga moms.
QAnon's audience was the yoga mom?
Oh, Mia, we are so happy to see you here with us today. We have been looking so forward to your visit. And for our viewers who just know you from Disinformed and perhaps some of your books, can you also kind of give us a snapshot of why your background is so valuable to understanding radicalization?
Well, so thank you so much for having me. It's great to meet you sort of virtually, although I've been following you on Twitter, and it's wonderful to meet both High Fidelity and Jim. My career sort of spans a very long time. I started studying terrorism in the 80s. Terrorism, I focused on different elements of it. So I've looked at particular tactics like suicide terrorism, and then I've looked at different kinds of operatives, women or children. And so it prepared me, at least I thought it prepared me, to study what people thought might be the next terrorist group, which was QAnon, from a psychosocial perspective, but also to look at some of the things that QAnon was doing that were very similar to ISIS.
Wow. I've got a million questions, but Jim, do you want to take the lead on this one?
Yeah, well, it's as we were talking before, Mia, it's good to talk face to face. Although I just have to say right now, Mia has been a friend and a supporter behind the scenes for well over a year with me, and I just want to say thank you personally for everything you've done.
So do I.
As you know, I follow the sort of origins of QAnon, how it got there, the people who are kind of running the show now. And ISIS happens to be the enemy that Mike Flynn and Eric Prince and a lot of these operators were fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about the actual ISIS techniques that were used to radicalize people into becoming suicide bombers, things like that, and how that compares to what, for example, Mike Flynn is doing with these Christo-fascist events where people are getting, religiously sort of brainwashed, for lack of a better word, into these ideologies. I would love to just hear you talk about, how those things compare, if they do.
So part of the reason I became interested in QAnon is that the National Science Foundation asked me to brief them, and then the Pentagon asked. And so once I had started working on QAnon, I was inside Telegram on the encrypted platforms for many years as a result of Department of Defense research grant to monitor the ways in which they radicalized people. What was the content? There was this thing, it's very much like from psychology and B.F. Skinner, about a variable schedule of reinforcement. They were maintaining people on the platform, almost kind of addicting them to the content by changing it around. So I was already in Telegram, and I had started to shift as a result of the decline of ISIS and its loss of its territorial base in Syria and Iraq to looking at the far right groups who were using some of the same language. And that's how I found QAnon, through these encrypted platforms. And what was so fascinating for me were that there were areas of overlap with ISIS. For example, the way they radicalized and got women involved. ISIS used to say to young girls who were living in France or the UK or the United States and Canada, did you want to help the children? And what ISIS did, what recruiters did, was that they used women to recruit other women. So women were not suspicious of the recruiter, but also they were really tugging at their heartstrings by talking about the children. And of course, that's exactly what QAnon women were doing, this pastel QAnon, which was, did you want to help the children, save the children? If you don't do something, all these girls are going to get trafficked and raped. And so there was this idea that if you didn't become involved, children would suffer. And so that was common. But then the other thing that's really interesting from a radicalization perspective, and, unless you study Islam, you're not necessarily familiar with this, but first of all, there's two kinds of jihad. There's the big jihad and the little jihad. When we as Westerners think about jihad, we're talking about the smaller one. And within the smaller one, there is offensive and defensive. And the reason that that's important is because we're assuming that jihad is always holy war, when in fact, for most Muslims, jihad is the effort every day to be a good person, not to eat pork or drink alcohol, to give charity and pray 5 times a day, all the things that they have to do. So within this idea of like an obligation, there's the general obligation that the community needs to respond. But when it's defensive, every single person needs to step up. And that's what QAnon is doing. QAnon is basically conveying to its followers that it is your individual obligation to do something. You need to step up. So that's why Edgar Welch gets in his car, drives something like 600 miles to DC to shoot up a pizzeria. In other words, people feel that it's their personal obligation to do something. And that is exactly what jihadis have done with, this small tranche of Salafi fighters for the last 20 plus years.
So I just wanted to follow up on that because for the last 2 days, I've been live tweeting Mike Flynn's QAnon conference. One of the big themes of it is bringing back Pizzagate, speaking of pizza. He's bringing back all of his propagandists about child trafficking, really saying things like, you really have to get into the mind of these evil pedophiles because they're coming for your children, right? That kind of thing. That's the kind of messaging we're talking about, right? Where they're saying to you, if you don't believe this, if you don't come into this in-group, children are going to die, and that feeds off of maternal instincts, right? Off of, human instincts.
It's absolutely the case. I think what's interesting from the Pizzagate perspective is, first of all, aside from the fact that it was, completely false, Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria doesn't have a basement, so there were no children tied up in the basement, that Edgar Welch himself has come out and said, I made a mistake. I was fed, these lies. And so it's interesting that the individual has admitted that it's fake. But the same people who amplified it, it was everyone from Mike Flynn to Alex Jones, and a number of the far-right echo chambers were using it as a cudgel against Hillary Clinton.
Yes.
And so there's that element. But I think this idea of like good and evil, which is also the way, you have as Jim calls them, the Christo-fascists, you have these extreme Christian beliefs that are very exclusionary, and it divides the world between not just different interpretations of God or different ways of praying or of having faith, but if you're not with us, you're against us, and you're on the side of evil. It really eliminates any kind of compromise, any space to meet halfway, because you don't meet halfway with child raping vampires that are drinking children's blood. So in other words, it really eliminates any of that middle ground and potential for compromise.
So what I want to talk about is, I'm a student of Jason Stanley's, and not until I read How Fascism Works did I understand how conspiracy theories are used as utility. That is what is used to create the unreality that makes people stop believing their minds, their what they see in front of them, their own truths, what's right in front of them, their eyes and ears. So conspiracy theories are used as this like gateway drug to start being able to radicalize people. And with that said, would you please explain to our viewers two things? One, why so many incredibly beautiful, amazing women I know who lead a holistic life believe that Dr. Fauci is the devil and have become like anti-science. And two, if you can talk a little bit about Ashley Babbitt.
It is really interesting, you know, when the surveys come out, whether it's the American Enterprises Institute that came out right after the January 6th failed coup, or even months later in May, the Institute for the Study of Religion, what they're finding, and if these surveys are representative samples, in other words, let's say they sampled 1,000 people, and that 1,000 people is representative of the population as a whole. We are looking potentially at 30 million American adults that believe this, you know, the more extreme elements of QAnon, which is that there's a cabal of blood drinking Democrats and Hollywood elites and a few royal families that have been trafficking and raping children and drinking their blood from time immemorial. So it is interesting, but they also broke it down by political identification. And while something like 29% were Republican, 7% said that they were Democrats. And I think what we saw in the summer of 2020 with the Save the Children campaign, sort of pretty quickly after the lockdowns happened, we saw that QAnon content had moved away from the underbelly of the internet in these chat rooms and had gone to Facebook and also Instagram. And it's really on Instagram where you see a lot of the yoga community, the natural food community, breastfeeding community. In other words, these are influencer moms that we tended to always associate with the left. In other words, you know, I don't know a lot of Republican vegans. So it was on all these timelines. And I think part of it had to do with the movie Plandemic. Plandemic got released and it pulled a lot of people on the left in. Now, keep in mind also, there has been an existing anti-vax community on the left, mistakenly on, you know, sort of assuming that it causes autism. So I think it was embraced by an existing sort of left side of the spectrum that has been circumspect about the medical community, that doesn't like the way OBGYNs default to C-sections. There's a lot of stuff on the left that has been critical of the scientific community and of doctors. And so you had this sort of meeting of the minds, the perfect storm, where on Instagram, you started to see all these influencers, and you even had leading yogis advocating, promoting Plandemic, but also promoting this idea that the vaccine was going to track you, it was going to poison you. And now I've seen just today all these, you know, people shaking. And I mean, it's really ridiculous. I mean, clearly they're faking it.
It's theater. It's obviously theater. Maybe they believe it.
Mickey Willis, I mean, is a really good example of, you know, the kind of horseshoe effect of QAnon, right? Mickey Willis was a leftist filmmaker who did Occupy and, you know, stuff like that, and so gradually got either pulled in involuntarily because he's in the cult or because he's grifting off of it, or both. Ended up in the Capitol, right? Yeah. This leftist filmmaker, and he just pulled all of the people that were with him along, right? And so a lot of what I follow in Telegram is like the star seeds and light workers and the kind of theosophical side of QAnon. How much did you look into that, all of that stuff?
Well, before you answer that, can you finish what we were?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't.
No. I just because I know
that was Mickey Willis and Plandemic's an important point.
No, it's a very important point. And in fact, Jim, I know when I'm talking to people, by the certain words that they use, this plandemonium and all this stuff, I can hear where their influences are. And once you sort of walk us through, because you set us up really well on how the wellness community got sucked in, and I definitely want to talk about how Russia was behind the origins of so much of our anti-science rhetoric. So they'd been greasing that wheel for years, but also people like Ashley Babbitt become weaponized to pull us into our corners and further pull us apart. But as somebody who understands how people get radicalized, what can you tell us about her case and also how that relates to the broader 30 million adult problem that we have in America.
One of the things associated, so we see, for example, within jihadi, that sort of side of extremism and radicalization, we've seen a lot of women, and a lot of women who convert and become Muslims, and maybe they don't quite know very much, they don't speak the language, and so they're very much reliant on the people around them to interpret the canon. And so they're easily manipulated. Among those convert women to the jihad, a lot of them have had experiences with physical abuse, drug abuse, alcohol abuse. In other words, there's something about them that is exploitable. And I mention that only because Ashley Babbitt's background, she had a lot of problems. And as you know, a number of people who are drawn into QAnon, the conspiracy offers them some sort of comfort, makes them feel better. And so when you're someone who's particularly vulnerable, either because there's a history of abuse in the family, or alcohol abuse, drug abuse, physical abuse, partner abuse, all of these things make someone maybe more susceptible to being lured in. And the tactics that is used by these groups, whether it's a cult, whether it's QAnon, whether it's a terrorist group, there's a bit of this love bombing. So all of a sudden, the person who feels alienated, isolated, alone, lonely, now all of a sudden they have all these friends and all these followers on Facebook and friend requests and people following them on Twitter, and anything that they post is liked and reposted. They start to feel really good about themselves. And so we see this thing going on with Ashley Babbitt that added to that, the fact that she had been a veteran of 3 tours, she had a certain amount of training and acumen. And so whether it's the Proud Boys or many of these other groups, when you have someone with a military background, it really is a very dangerous mix. And we saw, in terms of the susceptibility, Roseanne Boyland, who also died on the Capitol on January 6th, who was a QAnon supporter. But the difference is her family did not exploit the death in order to cash in and join the QAnon, these patriot, these conferences that Jim was talking about. The opposite. Roseanne Boyland's family blamed President Trump. And so that's why you never hear them talking about Roseanne. They only talk about Ashley. Well, for me, what was interesting was looking at Parlay, that when Ashley Babbitt first was shot and she died, they first accused her of being Antifa. And it was only days later that they flip-flopped again and said, no, she was a patriot. And I think Trump referred to her as a wonderful woman. But you see that they weren't sure how to deal with Ashley Babbitt initially. So one of the things I did was I tracked the flip-flopping.
Yes, the whole plan was to blame 1-6 on Antifa. Which we, figured out before it happened and warned Antifa not to go.
That was a brilliant illustration also of narrative warfare, of literally like just whatever's going to sell in order to keep this, So I have likened this so much to addiction, because I see the drip, 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 and I see where they crank it up, and I see how people start to build some sort of immunity, and then they go harder with it. And I also, we talk a lot about I'm still stuck on that 30 million adults. And we just had Keir Giles on, who just wrote a book, Russia's War on Everybody. And he said, until the presidents and leaders of Western countries stand up and say, we are target nations of cognitive warfare. We have been at war. This is hybrid warfare. Here's what it looks like. Here's where it's coming from. We're going to have a really hard time breaking through the denial. And do you have any clues or tips on how to break through the denial? And then please, address what Jim was saying about plandemic, because I think that's part of the same, 2 sides of the same coin.
I found it interesting. Take, for example, Marjorie Taylor Greene. She's been this QAnon promoter for a very long time, even before she was elected. When she was first running for her seat in North Georgia, Steve Scalise and Kevin McCarthy opposed her. Scalise donated to her opponent, and then she ran unopposed for the Republican nomination. What's interesting is, again, there is absolutely no credit from my perspective, no credibility for these Republicans, mainstream Republicans, who are looking at the QAnon caucus and they know that they're full of malarkey. They know that it's insanity, but they're going along with it because the QAnon supporters become Republican, like their fiercest base.
Yeah.
And so we see it with a lack of any kind of spine or ethics when the Republican leadership that knows full well that this is baloney goes along with it. And now we're seeing it echoing. It's filtering it down. It's not just Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene. It's Matt Gaetz and it's Andy Biggs and it's a bunch of others. For me, what's interesting is when in a court situation, whether it's Giuliani or Sidney Powell, when they're being cross-examined either by a district attorney, a lawyer, or a judge, they don't repeat these falsehoods. And so when you get them on the stand, they can't lie the way they can lie on Fox News. And so what I would say is we're not going to see anything change until principled Republicans come forward, not just the leaders of countries, because Bolsonaro has used it to his benefit. And we're seeing a number of right-wing groups throughout Europe using QAnon. There was a failed coup in December. The Reichsbürger in Germany, there was a plot in which you had a number of special forces, as well as I think someone who was royalty. But in other words,
and a Russian or two, a couple of Russian nationals.
It's always the Russians. It's always the Russians. But it is really problematic. One of the things we mentioned in the Pastels and Pedophile book, because my co-author speaks fluent Russian. She's Ukrainian. She speaks Ukrainian, Russian, German, Spanish, a whole bunch of languages. Wow. And I speak a bunch of other languages. So we were looking at QAnon in other languages. And so the irony from Russia's perspective is that from day one, the Russians amplified the QAnon content and made it go viral. But now Russia's having its own QAnon problem. So the same thing is true of China. But it is very interesting when our adversaries are using QAnon conspiracies to undermine our strength and democracy, our cohesiveness in the country. And now there's a bit of a backlash. What did Hillary once say? You can't have snakes in your neighbor's garden and don't expect that they're going to bite you.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, the most chilling part for me for Disinformed was the ending where it showed QAnon going global. Hi-fi.
So, a little bit of an introduction here. I grew up on the Something Awful forums. I went to 4chan. At the same time I was on 4chan and Something Awful, I was reading a lot of information, history about cult leaders, how they built their cults, conspiracy theories, Robert Anton Wilson, the Discordians, etc. What I did as a young man online is I actually kind of radicalized myself. I went to gore sites and dissociated myself and programmed myself with these things. One of the things I noticed about QAnon is they use the same tactic. They use dissociative violent video delivered digitally, and then they brainwashed people. And that is as I was exploring QAnon and what was going on, I noticed that ISIS does the same thing. Dissociative violence, brainwashing to make you feel better. Can you talk about that a little bit?
It's definitely one of the things when I did a C-SPAN interview. And, C-SPAN always has 3 phone lines, Republicans, Democrats, and independents. They added a 4th, and they added one for QAnon. So people who believed in QAnon were calling in. So I had a chance to actually talk to them. And I think it's important that, especially since Sophia Moskalenko, my co-author, is a clinical and social psychologist, the people who were drawn to this conspiracy theory were already hurting in some very basic way. Psychological pain is very high among people who believe in conspiracy theories. And what we saw is that there was an uptick in mental illness as a result of the lockdowns by 400%. So it is a real combination of an increase of mental illness, isolation, and sort of the echo chambers of being online significantly more than we were before the pandemic and before the lockdowns. And so the idea of exposing people to this content, so what I would say is people were already hurting when they went down the rabbit hole, and then the content to which they're exposed, as Hi-Fi you're saying, It's really graphic, violent, it's horrifying. And so I can totally understand somebody who's watching this, and it's this level of arousal, not the good arousal, the bad arousal, the level of arousal that you feel, oh my God, this has to stop. We need to do something. This is horrible. So I think that part of that, and then added the third element, is when they start telling people about it and people treat them like a pariah, and they get cut off from their friend networks, from their family. You don't want to invite them to Thanksgiving anymore. So isolation becomes reinforced. And so all they have left is this virtual community upon which that they are dependent. And I think that the blood and guts gore that ISIS used, we saw it from day one with the beheadings. They forced people in Iraq and Syria to physically attend the, any kind of capital punishment, especially if you were using Code of Hammurabi to cut off a hand for someone who steals, or cut off a head for someone who's done some grievous sin. And this traumatized the crowd, but it also has this way, like Hi-Fi is saying, of desensitizing you to violence. And so the violence doesn't become real. What really was interesting from my perspective with a lot of the way violence is presented within these QAnon echo chambers is that the children they're coming for, and they're talking about over 300,000 children a year are trafficked, which is a UN statistic, but the children they're always showing are white children. Like, it's not children who are trafficked that are in the suburbs of Michigan. Like, the children who are trafficked are from the global south, from Southeast Asia or Latin America, South America, parts of Africa. In other words, the children who are trafficked are not white. But in order to make it palatable for these Republican women, they recreate the conversation as being, we need to protect the white children, the suburban, your children. And this is how they pull them in. So it becomes automatic now. I feel I have to defend my community. I have to save my children from these horrible, evil people. And if you start Googling and say, well, there is a trafficking problem. So there's the tiny bit of truth in the conspiracy theory that is completely enveloped in fiction and in fantasy.
Right. And the Nancy Grace effect, when you say that, I just hear her, making, all that money year after year after year by focusing on one white child. And that is a bit horrifying. In a previous life, I was a news producer and still am a news producer, I guess, but independent now. Before that, it was for corporate news. And I did a lot of human trafficking stories. There was a lot of, there was one story I did, Snatched, where they showed girls being taken off the streets, and within 24 hours, they were turned out into the life. And that's because often these girls might have already had problems at home. They might be cutting class. There might be an older teenager, woman who was sort of the liaison, to the pimp in the neighborhood, who would say, hey, come here. And, these girls who are already having problems all of a sudden end up in a place they're not supposed to end up in. They get fed drugs, abused, and they're missing. And so those things are very real. And I think so much of what you say is that, and Jim always says that, with every conspiracy, there's that kernel of truth that draws people in. And our question always, episode after episode, is how do we draw them out? How do we get them back? When you talk about principled Republicans, I don't know such a person anymore. The Republican Party, as it once existed, no longer exists. Not if they're willing to play ball with the worst among us.
For me, what's so ironic is that Matt Gaetz is, allegedly involved in having sex with underage 17-year-old girls. And he's the one now, hanging out with Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lauren Boebert and pushing sort of some of the main buzzwords or the phrases. And I'm sitting there going, how is this acceptable? Like, if you're opposed,
projection.
If you're opposed to children being exploited, you don't have the guy that has sex with 17-year-olds. You sort of sitting among you. You really need to disavow it if you're going to have any credibility. But of course, it's not credible, because when there have been bills in Congress, the same people who are always talking about child trafficking opposed any legislation to cut down on child trafficking. So it's all about, for me, a lot of this QAnon stuff with the leadership, not with the rank and file who genuinely believe it, It's about a grift. It's about a vote. It's about a money. It's about contributing to their Venmo or their whatever accounts, like Tracy Bean's, monetizing this. And it is, again, it's problematic when you have people like Tucker Carlson who reiterate these most extreme comments. And so it's not just on One American News or on Newsmax, but it's on Fox News. And the more it becomes mainstream, like the Tea Party was 20 years ago, the more it's going to be harder and harder to get people out of the rabbit hole, because there's going to be more and more people who subscribe to it.
Right. Jim?
I mean, for me, there is a simple fix that would help, which is to stop Fox News from broadcasting Kremlin propaganda designed to brainwash people, all the way to getting Telegram, which all it is tens of millions of people getting brainwashed all day long, at least in America. Get that off the Apple Store, for God's sake. Why are we providing these rabbit holes for people to fall into? Because once they're in there, they get stuck, right? But I guess the question is, and we've seen some examples of this. Once you get the poison to stop being encircling someone's mind, very often they'll just find their own way out, right? Because the information becomes like a cult compound. Like they used to need to be able to take you to Waco and put you in Koresh's compound to make you in a cult, but now they do it with information. So do you feel like I do that if we were able to at least cut off some of these major sources, that it would substantially help?
One of the things that came up in these QAnon forums on Telegram was they were saying, don't watch Fox News, that Fox News and OAN and Newsmax were, and I quote, Luciferian, that you should only get your news from them. In other words, further narrowing the circle of trust and intensifying the echo chamber so that the only place people will get their news is from Telegram. And Pavel Durov, who is the owner of Telegram, was particularly reticent. His whole shtick is that he's talking about freedom of speech, but he was the last remaining holdout in terms of ISIS propaganda. So when all of the other open API platforms, as early as 2016, stopped allowing ISIS on their platforms, whether it was Twitter or Facebook or Google, YouTube, all of these, Telegram was still the platform of choice for ISIS. So given how late it took and how long it took Durov to deplatform ISIS, I don't see him doing anything about QAnon. At the end of the day, part of it is, and again, I credit Sophia with this because she is a trained psychologist. She talks about ways in the book, how step by step, how to make people less vulnerable to the conspiracy, but also how to pull them out. So,
Right.
for example, in the last chapter, she gives you a bunch of questions and she gives you the answer about, that conversation with the friend or family about QAnon and asking them questions and not setting it up as a combative conversation, right. Because we know psychologically people, because of confirmation bias, they double or triple down. So I'm right, and I'm going to, like a dog with a bone, I'm not going to at any point admit that I might not be right. And what she's saying is that's not the approach to use. The approach to use is a much slower approach and sort of just plant seeds of doubt and then be there for that friend or family to help them out. And I think that, it's not a quick fix, but of course they fall down the rabbit holes in 30 minutes. You're not going to get them out in 30 minutes. And then the other thing is what we understand with terrorism and radicalization. Sometimes it's just changing the behavior. Getting at people's hearts and minds really raises that bar of difficulty, because we can't ever really know if the person is just saying what we want to hear, or it's called social desirability, or if they genuinely believe it. So I think having some of the formers talking about their experiences at the same time that we're creating off-ramps, and I'll give you why I use the term off-ramp. a lot of people join jihadi groups and these terrorist groups because they're outraged at the treatment of Muslims in Iraq, or the starvation of children in Iraq because of the sanction regime under George Bush, or Islamophobia that has spread throughout Western countries and intensified during Donald Trump's administration. And so they have a right to be angry. But if the only thing that they can do with that anger is join a terrorist group, one of the things that we've suggested over the years is, why don't you channel that into something pro-social instead of something antisocial? And I think that if people who want to help children started to participate in actually helping children, then they could feed that part of their psyche that actually wants to help altruistically, but then they wouldn't be involved with these, horrible groups that are just basically further traumatizing them.
Wow, amazing. High five. One more question, and then we're going to talk a little bit about your books.
We talk about the child trafficking problem. And I would offer up people who truly want to save children, as you just said, to volunteer for their foster care systems, because it seems to me that a lot of children do get abused in the foster care system and do go missing in the foster care system, even though it's supposed to be taking care of them. How do we explain to people that what is being done is they're taking real problems, real things that exist, they're twisting it, they're weaponizing it, and they're using it against their opponents, primarily for political reasons, but ultimately to try to radicalize people into killing machines like ISIS does?
Well, the first thing that's important, because we approach this, both Sophia and I have been studying terrorism for such a long time, and Sophia literally wrote the book on radicalization, so she's been her assessment checklist is the industry standard for assessing radicalization. And so we approached QAnon thinking we were going to find a potential terrorist group, because that's what Christopher Wray was saying, and that's what the DHS Alejandro Mayorkas was saying, and even Attorney General Merrick Garland was concerned about the terrorism potential. And what we found instead is that the vast majority of people who are posting and sharing content and talking about QAnon probably are never going to do anything. So I did want to sort of caveat that to say, I don't think we have 30 million potential terrorists in the country, because if we did, we are screwed. Like, there's never been a terrorist group that's been that popular. But at the same time, it's really important that, one of the things I did, and it was an article that came out as I made reference to it in the book, but I needed actual data. So we went through the actual Save the Children, the charity Save the Children. We went through all of their social media and their recruiting posters and their funding drives. And we looked and we counted how many children were white. And then we looked at the Save the Children campaign that was on Facebook and Instagram for QAnon, and how many children were diverse. And what we found is that with Save the Children, 98% of the images were children who were not white. But the QAnon was 93% white. And so such a huge difference. But what the people at Save the Children told me off the record, so I'm not mentioning names, but they said that when the Save the Children campaign was going on, they were getting death threats, because what QAnon influencers were saying is that these charities, CARE, Save the Children, all of these really good charities that have been helping children, Christian Children's Fund, were actually trafficking the children.
Oh my God.
And so they were calling the police on the charities. In other words, not only were they not helping, but they were actually hurting these groups. The same thing is true with these fake allegations of child trafficking. It's kind of like swatting. They would call in a tip, and this uses whatever limited resources that the police and investigators have. So it's really important that if they want to do something for children, we show them that there are better ways to do it. And if you don't want to do it for some large corporation because, and I'm quoting their view, that these civil society organizations and NGOs, that their leadership makes too much money. Like, how dare the head of this charity make $250,000, then you know what? Act locally. Go work at a homeless shelter or go do something. And that's one of the things Sophia says. Even volunteering will activate that same altruistic aspect of your heart and brain that is feeding people, that is making them feel better about themselves. And it's not QAnon. So there are ways of acting local that you can help your community. And instead of, being one of these digital warriors online.
Yes. Beautiful.
Digital soldiers.
Yes. Jim, do you have anything else you want to say before we just make sure we get her to mention all her books for our viewers?
Yeah, I just, one of the most important tools that is used is dehumanization, right? And you were talking about, how if you confront a QAnon member, that they, with their beliefs, that just confirms it, right? It confirms what they think about you. So instead of being the human you were before, you are now the enemy. You are some, object that is, that causes you, cognitive dissonance, right?
Right.
Because when you challenge someone's beliefs that have been burned into their brain like that, it causes mental pain. It literally hurts them. So I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit about the in-group, out-group phenomenon and how that contributes to dehumanizing people, which ultimately goes to a very, very bad place.
Mm-hmm.
And dehumanization, I think, on the 10 stages of genocide, I think dehumanization is number 5 or 6. In other words, creating this out-group that you don't see them as the same as yourself. For example, the classic example is sort of the Nazi soldier who's playing with his child and then bashing a Jewish child's head into a wall, doesn't see them both as children. In other words, the Jewish child is dehumanized and no longer is even comparable to their own child. We saw this, for example, in the Rwandan genocide, where they would refer to the Tutsi as inyenzi or cockroaches. So when this language is used, and this is why it's so important that even in the UK, I think one of the ministers was challenged that she shouldn't be referring to immigrants as scum or disease. In other words, when you deal with a group of people and you say either they're evil, they're Satan worshiping, or you dehumanize them and say that they are vermin or cockroaches or a disease to be eradicated, you're taking away their humanity, which makes it easier, as Jason Stanley would say, to treat them following these authoritarian rules, not just of exclusion, but of extermination. Yeah. And so it's a very dangerous game that we're seeing being played out by the raising the temperature on the language. And it's one of the reasons, for example, you won't hear me say, oh, people who believe in QAnon are a bunch of stupid idiots and they're uneducated. Like, you don't hear us in the book even talk badly, because I think a lot of people, and I'm not talking about the influencers who have monetized it, but I'm talking about sort of the rank and file. I think a lot of people approached it because they thought they were doing the right thing. And so because I want to give them the benefit of the doubt and not treat them like idiots, I think that that's one of the differences. And we've had a number of people who are ex-QAnon who read the book. They read the book to attack us, or they read maybe a snippet of it somewhere, and they actually thought that we were kinder and gentler in the way that we had handled why they fell down the rabbit hole. But once they're down the rabbit hole, they become more manipulatable. I mean, so more easily manipulated by these charismatic individuals like Flynn. And Flynn learned a lesson. He learned how ISIS behaved, but he also learned how to fight them. But at the end of the day, Flynn was removed from DIA by President Obama because he was kind of extreme, and he was an extreme Islamophobe. And I think that when we have situations where we denude someone's intention and motivation of any humanity, we have a problem. And so, for example, I have very, very close friends who are evangelicals. There are things that we do not agree on, but we find areas to agree. And I think that that's true for anyone. The only way the country is really going to heal and stop being so partisan is we can't just look at the other side and create caricatures of how stupid and gullible they are. We actually have to have these conversations. And that's one of the things we wanted to do with the book, is start the conversation.
Well, speaking of which, we have viewers that are global. They buy books. Can you tell us about the 3 or 4 most important books you've written that could be helpful in them understanding what we are up against, as well as give us a line on your upcoming book and promise that you'll come back as well?
I will definitely come back. So it's behind me. This is the book, Pastels and Pedophiles, Inside the Mind of QAnon.
Hold it up one more time. Hold it up just one more time.
Say it again.
The shameless plug.
Oh, we love that. It's important.
So,
okay.
And of course, it's a white blonde woman, and that was quite deliberate. But part of it is we wanted to explain, where did QAnon come from? Where did some of these tropes come from? The anti-Semitic tropes, the anti-Catholic tropes. And the thing that we discovered in the course of doing the research is, although they refer to Hollywood as Pedowood, so much of QAnon main sort of mythology or ideology is stolen from books and from movies. So like this whole thing with adrenochrome, that's from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
Yeah.
And in fact, they have this.
Hi-Fi's been saying that for years.
And also the Where We Go One We Go All is from White Squall in 1996. That that's not engraved on John F. Kennedy's the bell on his ship. That was from White Squall. So we found all these areas where, well, isn't that interesting? We just totally, and of course, most of the movies that they stole the stuff from were not popular movies, because trust me, if I stole something from Star Trek or Back to the Future, millions of people would recognize it, right? Or if I wore my T-shirt from the company in Alien, you would have a subset of people that recognized what corporation that was. But if I'm using films that nobody saw, then there is this psychological effect of, it sounds vaguely familiar, so it must be true. The other books written are less salient for our conversation, because they're the ones that are behind me. They're mostly on terrorism. And so I wrote a book, and that's why I was so interested in children. I wrote a book called Small Arms, which was the ways that the groups were brainwashing children to turn them into suicide bombers. And I actually spent weeks in Pakistan with the kids who had been saved. And so if you can deprogram a jihadi, a child jihadi, you can deprogram anyone.
Okay.
It's possible. And the new book is a follow-up to the book behind me called Bombshell, where I looked at women in the jihadi groups, because when Bombshell came out, ISIS didn't exist yet. And we didn't have Boko Haram using women yet. And that book's going to be called Veiled Threats. And that should be coming out with Cornell University Press in 2023. I should also add, just to explain to your viewers, the reason I publish mostly with university presses is because there's a vetting mechanism, so that everything is cited, everything is well sourced. And so the narrative is very accessible, but if you want to read more, you can go to the footnotes and look at the original document.
Fantastic. I love that. Oh my gosh. Well, we want to thank you so much for spending time with us today. We want you to come back. And even though, I guess the last question that I have, so much of what we do dates back to chaos that is created, out of Putin's Russia and the Russian state. Is there one line or 2 lines you can tell our viewers who are still in denial that we are the target nation of a hybrid warfare, and that we are exploited in every direction, and that, truthfully, when you peel it back, you'll find some of that in the work that you do?
Over Christmas, we saw that the Russians had hacked into the FBI, into a number of the regional FBI offices. I reported it right away. And then last week, they hacked into the National Security Agency, the NSA. So I reported that as well. I mean, they are actively every single day hacking into government agencies in order to get as much information about special agents, to get compromised. I saw one woman, I saw her doctor's appointments, I saw her personal emails, I saw everything about her that they were showing because they were selling it. And so I think that we have to realize that it's not just, the IRA, the Internet Research Agency that was involved in the 2016 election, but it's a daily Russian cyber warfare, but that the Chinese are doing it, the North Koreans are doing it, Iran is doing it. So we are seeing this spread globally. All of our adversaries are trying to use the internet against us. So we shouldn't play along. If something looks suspicious, if it's disinformation, misinformation, check, double check. I know people like to say they did their own research, but when they're doing their research in a closed information system, they're never going to get disconfirming data. So I want to tell people, do the research, read widely, read things you may not agree with, and then you'll have a better analytical tool to assess the veracity of what's coming in the future.
Oh my gosh, this is more than I could have ever dreamed of. Dr. Mia Bloom, thank you so much for coming. Support her works, buy her books, and offline we're going to swap some recipes.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great. It was great meeting you virtually, and it was so nice to see Jim. I'm so glad he's back on Twitter.
Yeah.
Me too, Mia, and thank you so much for being here. Virtual hug.
Yeah, virtual hugs all around. Wow, what a brilliant woman,
Mia is a literal genius and one of the kindest people I've ever met in my life.
Just incredible. I'm so grateful that she spent time with us today. Please always buy the books of our brilliant experts, because it really helps them continue to do their vital work. And the clip that I'd like to end on is that we have allowed a manipulation of our elections going back prior to 2016. And had we have fought a little bit harder, for a couple of our elections, perhaps things would be a little bit different and we'd be a bit further along when it comes to climate change. So much of what we do here, when we peel it back, we find the petro gangsters, the oil gangsters, the mafia state of Russia, and we also find many domestic fossil fuel executives funding so much of what we just talked about through Council for National Policy and other places. And this is my intro to say, what if we hadn't allowed Roger Stone to choose the outcome in Bush v. Gore? What might our world have looked like?
And I'd like to say, there is a righteous anger that should take place in people when terrible things happen. But right now, the clip we're about to show, people on the right are taking one man's righteous anger and attempting to portray him in a negative light because he has this righteous anger. That's wrong.
Well, I think we should be righteously outraged. Let's join Al Gore in his righteous anger at not doing enough for climate justice.
People are familiar with that thin blue line that the astronauts bring back in their pictures from space. That's the part of the atmosphere that has oxygen, the troposphere, and it's only 5 to 7 kilometers thick. That's using as an open sewer. If you could drive a car straight up in the air at interstate highway speeds, you'd get to the top of that blue line in 5 minutes. And all the greenhouse gas pollution would be below you. We're still putting 162 million tons into it every single day. And the accumulated amount is now trapping as much extra heat as would be released by 600,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding every single day on the Earth. That's what's boiling the oceans, creating these atmospheric rivers and the rain bombs and sucking the moisture out of the land and creating the droughts and melting the ice and raising the sea level and causing these waves of climate refugees predicted to reach 1 billion in this century. Look at the xenophobia and political authoritarian trends that have come from just a few million refugees. What about 1 billion? We would lose our capacity for self-governance.